Deborah. Good evening, everyone. We are very happy to host tonight the Secretary General of NATO, His Excellency Yap de Hoop Schaeffer. When I say we, I mean we are co-hosting it, in fact. The Atlantic Forum of Israel, chaired by Professor Arad, is one of them, and he's on the podium. And the other one is the Insitute for National Strategic Studies. Please disregard these signs or imagine that there is a bigger one of the Atlantic Forum, where we are equal in hosting.
But small is beautiful.
Small is beautiful. So we are the co-hosts of the Secretary General of NATO. Before giving the mic to Uzi Arad, I would like to say that I personally enjoyed, as the former ambassador to the EU and NATO, personal relations. Janine, his wife, who's with us in the front row, hosted us in their house, which was not far from our house in Brussels. And beyond that, the bilateral relations between Israel and NATO and the Mediterranean dialogue really flourished during your tenure, Secretary General. In this respect, I would like to thank also the other members of your team who are here with us, and especially Nicola De Santis, who worked very hard for this event, as he did work for another event which took place just a few weeks ago, which was really a heart warmer in the sense that we had participants from other countries in the Middle East in a seminar hosted by the INSS and organized by NATO. And this is, I think, a very important aspect of public diplomacy and quiet diplomacy, which was very effective. And I wish we could continue with this sort of a dialogue, which are not necessarily counter to or contradictory to bilateral relations, which we would like to expand with the NATO institutes and various activities. I will stop here and I will ask. So, first of all, welcome, Secretary General, and I'll ask Uzi to take the mic for a few minutes.
Thanks, Oded.
Thank you very much, Oded, and welcome to you, Mr. Secretary General, as well, on behalf of the Atlantic Forum of Israel. I gather that this event is memorable and interesting for more than one reason. It is not your first time visiting Israel. You've been here before in many capacities, but as Secretary General of NATO, you've been here before, a few years back. Also, under the auspices of the newly formed Atlantic Forum of Israel, as a body that sought to promote closer NATO-Israeli cooperation and integration. And this is perhaps the moment for me to thank you on behalf of that forum for the fact that you have given it your very wise support from the beginning, and the fact that I think that as you are nearing the end of your term, you can register progress made in that connection. And of course, you're better positioned than anyone else to document that progression. But we at the forum applaud you for that, as well as that we applaud you for your captainship of the alliance. I've seen you in action, and I think you'll be hearing a great deal of appreciation for the way you've steered the alliance through very, very difficult times, as it is now nearing its 60th anniversary, as it is redefining its mission and objectives, and you have been at the helm, and I think you've earned the admiration of many from far, like Israel, and from closer, Europe and North America. The reason and then there is another aspect here which has to do with Oded, because Oded here is, of course, the host in his capacity of being the director of the Institute, but also you, Mr. Secretary, as well as I, humbly, know what special role Oded has played personally as ambassador to Brussels in promoting and advancing that relationship. So he too should be celebrating with some satisfaction the fact that you are here and that the fact that the record is what it is. Now, one point which is, I would say, about substance. When we Israelis at the Atlantic Forum thought that it was opportune for us to get our communities together, it was very much in the aftermath of September 11 and the recognition at the beginning of this decade that when we look at the world, we are confronting common problems, common threats, all, unfortunately, most, if not all, emanating from the Middle East, be it the proliferation of nuclear weapons, of the eruption of radical Islam and extremism in most violent forms of terrorism all over the world. All these problems come from our neighborhood, and us being at the forefront of this struggle, with the Atlantic Alliance being there, we shared this common problem. Now, this affects our very soul, because as I think you too, when you are redefining your missions, and you recognize that at the end of the day, the Atlantic Alliance is the alliance of like-minded nations which share values, which in effect is the Western world. And we here in Israel, very much by sharing the same values of the Western world, felt, as we said, that that was our habitat, and that we were facing those who essentially oppose the interest as well as the values of the Western world. Now, I'm making that point because at this very moment, both the Alliance and Israel are locked in fierce battle with some of the exponents of this form of hostility. The Alliance is managing the war in Afghanistan. And in Afghanistan, you are confronting other parts of the same type of threat. We here, too, have been fighting either Hezbollah and more recently now the Hamas, all products of the same historical movement, all manifesting the same disregard for some of the values that we share. Since it is an alliance of like-minded people, we are also tormented by some of the same operational problems. For example, how to dispense our missions while minimizing civilian casualties, how to fight asymmetrical wars and serving the legitimate defense interests that we share together while preserving our own values. This is a problem that you in Afghanistan has confronted again and again. And we have observed and we understood also some of the dilemmas that you had to face when inadvertently you have also inflicted collateral damage here and there, as was unavoidable. It seems to me that at this moment of crisis here in Israel, some of us expect the same degree of empathy when we face similar problems. And we do have some problems because our enemies exhibit the same disregard for the same values while holding their population as human shields, while benefiting of the fact that we are sensitive to what they are not. So it is not only that we should effectively do what we are supposed to be doing together or separately, but I would expect a kind of solidarity in us doing that when it comes to us here in Israel facing some of these difficulties. That is the true test of an alliance, and that is the true test of like-minded people involved in the same struggle. But that was a thought shared with you, Mr. Secretary, and without further ado, I would like again to thank you for your role in promoting our relations, and I would urge you now to tell us what should be on your mind.
Thank you, Uzi, for your words of wisdom. I just want to recognize the presence here of a couple of people and I hope not to offend any other. We have with us tonight former Minister of Defense Misha Arens. We have with us a member of Knesset of the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, member Amira Dotan. We have some hopefuls for the next Knesset with us, but I don't want to comment on this. And so, without further ado, Mr. Secretary General.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Aran. Thank you, Odette. Thank you very much, Professor Arad. Thank you, Uzi. About Odette Aran first, when I was coming in a moment ago with my wife, he said, I'm very happy in my present position because I can say yes when I want to say yes, and I can say no when I want to say no. I knew Odette Aran in Brussels that he did that already when he was an ambassador, so that should be not too much of a fundamental change in this regard. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, on behalf of my wife, my delegation, a warm thanks to the Insitute of National Strategic Studies and the Atlantic Forum of Israel for co-hosting this event. As Odette already said, in cooperation with NATO's Public Diplomacy Division. I think both institutions have been instrumental in bringing NATO and Israel closer together, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to address you here today. As you know, and as I think was mentioned already, next April, beginning of April, NATO will celebrate its 60th anniversary. And that makes NATO almost exactly 1 year younger than the State of Israel. Now, if a state turns 60, that is considered to be a rather young age. By contrast, if an alliance of states turns 60, people consider this to be a very old age. And it's easy to see why. Classical alliances were forged to deal with a specific threat, and once that threat had been overcome or defeated, they dissolved again. Alliances were short-term marriages of convenience without a long life expectancy. NATO is different. First, it is a permanent alliance. When NATO was founded just 4 years after the Second World War, it encapsulated a fundamental lesson of that war. The lesson that Europe and North America not only shared a common heritage and common values, but also a common future. Second, NATO was never just a military alliance to deal with a singular threat. Of course, the shadow of Soviet military power loomed large at NATO's founding in 1949, but the logic of alliance went beyond the logic of immediate military protection. NATO gave a politically, economically, and morally devastated Europe the necessary reassurance to cope with the many challenges that it faced. And it created the security framework that allowed former wartime enemies to become friends and to get on with the new project of European integration. But there is a third and perhaps even more important difference between NATO and traditional military alliances. NATO is a framework for political change. Indeed, it is an instrument to shape change. In the Cold War, that role was severely constrained. Today, however, NATO's role as a political agenda setter has become obvious. It has become obvious in the way in which NATO has helped the consolidation of Europe as an undivided, democratic security space. It has become obvious in its missions in the Balkans and Afghanistan, where NATO is changing realities on the ground in order to give these regions a new lease of life. It has become obvious in the humanitarian roles that NATO has performed after a major earthquake had hit Pakistan some years ago, and in our ongoing logistical support for the African Union in the crisis over Darfur and in Somalia. And it has become obvious here in the Middle East. During the Cold War, a Secretary General of the Atlantic Alliance could not say anything about this region. The Middle East, as many of you might remember, was considered out of area for NATO, a region far beyond the collective interest of the NATO allies. Indeed, I think I'm exaggerating only slightly when I say that for the Cold War NATO, Tel Aviv or Amman were as far away as Tokyo or Beijing. This started to change in the mid-1990s when NATO launched its Mediterranean dialogue, an effort to build trust and understanding with 7 North African and Middle Eastern countries, including Israel. And I reveal no secret when I say that from the outset, Israel has been and still is a most enthusiastic dialogue partner. But I also hasten to add that this dialogue has had considerable growing pains. On the one hand, NATO allies had different views on what to expect from the dialogue. And on the other hand, some Mediterranean dialogue partners found it difficult to figure out what they could gain from engaging in this process. And thirdly, the lack of progress in the Middle East peace process made some dialogue countries hesitant to commit to a NATO initiative. In short, for a decade or more, the Mediterranean dialogue did not achieve its full potential. In the regions to NATO's east, from the Caucasus to Central Asia, NATO's policy of partnership was able to change the security dynamic for the better. In the regions to NATO's south, however, a similar success remained out of reach. Now, a pessimist may argue that the current turmoil in Gaza is just another indication that NATO's notions of dialogue, partnership and cooperation are simply not applicable to this region. According to that pessimistic view, the Middle East is condemned to an endless cycle of mistrust, violence and counter-violence, a cycle that no one can break for good. Indeed, there is a risk that current developments threaten to set us back. They risk sowing the seeds of future conflict. And that is why I call on all parties to implement the relevant United Nations Security Council resolution. Hamas should realize that through its constant rocket attacks on Israel, it has brought tremendous suffering upon the very people it claims to represent. And I doubt that this is the kind of representation the people of Gaza had in mind when they elected Hamas into office. Israel, in turn, should accept a ceasefire to allow for the necessary humanitarian aid to be delivered into Gaza constantly. And all the parties concerned should make all possible efforts to ensure the successful conclusion of the Egyptian-led talks to help create the conditions for an enduring end of the violence. It goes without saying, ladies and gentlemen, that recent events in and around Gaza are certainly most worrying. And if you add the international community's up till now unsuccessful attempts to halt the Iranian nuclear program, it is easy to see why the pessimists on the Middle East find so much resonance. But I think we must not let our future be decided by the pessimists. Continuing to work for opportunities to build new patterns of security cooperation across the Mediterranean and throughout the Middle East is not a sign of naivete. Given the pivotal importance of this region, fostering cooperation is an investment in regional and indeed global security. It is an investment that promises a return, even if that return may come in trickles only rather than in waves. In an age of globalization, in an age that is characterized by religious fundamentalism, terrorism, and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, the interdependence between the northern, eastern, and southern shores of the Mediterranean has become simply too obvious to ignore. Accordingly, cooperation in the framework of the Mediterranean dialogue has accelerated, and the dialogue is increasingly accepted as a viable framework that serves the interests of all partners. I'm not going to bore you tonight with statistics on the Med dialogue, As I mentioned before, Israel has been a most enthusiastic dialogue partner, and that tells me that this country knows full well about the dialogue and about the benefits that it brings. Israel was the first country to develop an individual cooperation program with NATO, followed by Egypt, and hopefully soon by Jordan. I just come from Jordan. That was my previous stop. And I think this should encourage other dialogue partners to embark on similar processes. Israel's forward-looking approach is also visible in its contribution to the so-called Operation Active Endeavour in the Mediterranean, and by its steady increase in other areas of the dialogue, notably in science, public diplomacy, and armaments cooperation. So clearly there is no need for a load of statistics to demonstrate Israel's interest in the dialogue process. But there are still a few facts that deserve to be highlighted. For one thing, the dialogue is increasingly turning into a framework that engages all dialogue partners and not just a few. This does not change the logic of self-differentiation, according to which it is largely up to our dialogue partners to determine the pace and the scope of our cooperation. But it does suggest that there is a growing awareness among all dialogue partners that this framework can become more than the sum of its parts. Indeed, if our partners today refer to the acquis of the dialogue, they say as much. Given the fact that NATO is a bilingual organization, I should at least one word of French tonight. You've heard it, acquis. A second development that I want to highlight is the growing depth both of our practical cooperation and of our political dialogue. A fact that Foreign Minister Tzipi Livni explicitly welcomed when she participated in the meeting of NATO and Mediterranean Dialogue Foreign Ministers last December in Brussels. The dialogue now offers us the opportunity to conduct open and frank discussions on regional security, including with countries with which Israel does not have diplomatic relations. We have joint exercises as well. And as I mentioned earlier, we even have Israel's participation in NATO's naval anti-terrorist operation Active Endeavour in the Mediterranean. To me, ladies and gentlemen, this clearly shows that the security dynamic here in this region can be changed, perhaps slowly, but surely. And that is why we need to continue to generate new ideas to sustain this cooperative momentum. And for example, in that vein, 2 years ago, we launched the NATO Training Cooperation Initiative. It is rooted in a simple fact. After 60 years of multinational cooperation, NATO has more know-how in the area of military training and education than any other institution in the world. At our NATO Defense College in Rome, in Italy, which now includes a dedicated Middle Eastern faculty, we have held several courses in the framework of this initiative, and I would like to encourage you to continue to participate in this endeavour. When we consider, ladies and gentlemen, the many serious and unresolved issues in the Middle East, from the issue of Palestine all the way to the Iranian nuclear program, NATO-Israeli cooperation in the dialogue may appear small and insignificant. It is therefore not surprising that some observers call for bolder steps. For example, a NATO-led force for the region. Since I was the first Secretary General of NATO who has broached this possibility in public, I am certainly not opposed to such an idea in principle. The international community is working towards an end to the violence in Gaza, where, let me underline that, a role for NATO is not foreseen. Let me, however, use this opportunity to reiterate the three conditions for NATO to play a role. First, a comprehensive peace agreement. Second, of course, consent of the parties. And third, a UN mandate. If these conditions were met, I could imagine that NATO would find it hard to say no if the allies were asked to make a contribution to Mideast peace. But we are unfortunately a long way from meeting those conditions. And that is why we need to focus on NATO's current contributions. I realize that NATO is not the solution, but it can make solutions easier to attain. And that is why we should work towards a more structured NATO role in the Middle East, notably, as I said, in the area of training and capacity building. Such a role will force the allies, Europe and North America, to develop coherent, long-term policies for this region, and it will also help to dispel mistrust that still exists in some parts of the region vis-à-vis NATO. And it will help, I think, to develop a common security agenda, not just between the individual partner countries and NATO, but ideally also among the individual countries in the region. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, at the age of 60, NATO can look back at a very successful track record. Not only has it successfully protected the security of its member states, that is its core business, and that business it will continue, it has also been able to shape its strategic environment in ways that the founding fathers of this alliance never dared to dream of back in 1949. Can this success story be extended to regions outside of Europe? Specifically, can the formula of partnership, dialogue and cooperation be applied in the Middle East and offer us a similar promise of success? It's too soon to answer this question with absolute certainty, but as the growing cooperation between Israel and NATO demonstrates, we have reasons to remain optimistic. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm ready to take your comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General. When I saw you stepping into the building, I don't know whether you noticed, but I had a sigh of relief because myself and two of my colleagues, we wrote an article in the New York Times saying that Iran is a major threat to Israel and indeed to the whole region and maybe beyond. And in order to get tough with Iran, you need sanctions agreed, tougher sanctions agreed by the two other members, China and mostly Russia. And if the price is removing missiles from the Czech Republic and Poland or not deploying them, and not pushing the membership of Ukraine and Georgia, maybe we should pay the price. And I thought, well, if the Secretary General reads this, maybe he will think twice of coming to the Institute. But I'm glad that you, either you didn't read it or you read it and you said.
Thank you for widening the circle of that, anyway. In order not to be remiss, I want to acknowledge the presence here of my successor in Brussels, Ran Curiel. We have ambassadors of members of from the members of NATO, and I will not go into naming all of them. Two are worth mentioning. In a specific, all of them are worth mentioning, but two in specific because the Canadian ambassador is now the contact point, and the Italians very much wanted it, as you know better than I do. You know too much again.
And there they sit together side by side, so you can make peace in the Middle East. And so you agreed very kindly to answer questions. I will put the limit to 5 questions. Some of the questions you already somewhat answered. So who would like to open up? I know volunteer. There's a mic there. I don't know if you're off.
Thank you very much. My name is Amit Mor. I'm a director of an energy environmental consulting firm here in Israel, also teaching in the Interdisciplinary Center in Herzliya, energy issues. I'd like to tell you, and I'm sure you know, but also the audience, that NATO not only dealing with the so-called obvious issues that you very kindly presented and the other speakers, but we had the honor of getting facilitation from NATO last year for a conference we initiated, took place with the London School of Economics under the title Enhancing Energy Security in the Middle East through Regional Cooperation on Renewable Energy. Now, this conference took place in London. I had the pleasure of co-chairing that with my colleague, professor from London School of Economics, with the participation of all North African and Middle Eastern countries, with the participation of NATO, World Bank, and EU. And the ideas which came up together will be published in a book shortly. And initial cooperation, especially of utilizing solar energy, which is a comparative advantage of all this region, desert, and a lot of desert, and very high radiation, to enhance energy security. And NATO takes a role in facilitation this issue as well, via the Mediterranean dialogue. So what we see here, as we view it, is broadening the activity of NATO, not only to what we call regular or obvious security issues, but also so the tough issues of energy security. And indeed, we urge you to continue to facilitate us, people in the region, to continue with this type of activity. Thank you.
Although I didn't see or hear the question mark at the end, on behalf of the public diplomacy, we offer you a contract in NATO. Reuven Merchav, the former Director General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
I will not use the mic, but Your Excellency, you referred very eloquently to Iran, saying that we shouldn't be pessimists and we should be working on it, and you alluded to it in some other form. Iran will maybe very soon a nuclear neighbor to NATO. And this is a thing which you have probably not forgotten. Now, Iran's nuclearization, given the fact that the general policy of Iran vis-à-vis the Middle East has not been the most responsible one, being a major exporter of all kinds of devices and terror, has to be scrutinized very, very carefully. And I think it is for the first time in the 60 years history of NATO that you have a nuclear, that you may have a nuclear neighbor with whom you don't have a real arrangement, unlike the one which was in the Cold War, where you had a mutual deterrence. This, I think, brings into the picture a completely new vista, which is outside the scope of the Israeli policy. Of course, for us it is vital, but I think this should place before you or your successor or before NATO in general a major burden of work, proof, and thinking. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let me try to, you might be surprised, let me combine the first remark and the second question, although they are on completely different subjects. Energy and Iran. Of course, I cannot make a speech about the present day threats and challenges without mentioning Iran. Because as you say, and as we immediately will agree, that threat is a fundamental one, and the international community has not yet been able to be as effective as I would like the international community to be against that threat. But here comes a but, and that but is also relevant for energy. And I can add, if I go one step further to the present day events in this region, that but is even also relevant for Gaza. Because we must distinguish really between what NATO as an alliance should take on its plate, and what, of course, NATO allies, and we all know to what allies I'm referring to, are very proactively trying to make successful. NATO allies are trying to see that Iran becomes less of a danger than it is at the very moment. NATO allies are, in other capacities, very active in energy security, and NATO does that on the basis, that's my reference to your first remark, sir, on the basis of where can NATO add value. I do not think at the moment NATO can add value on the Iranian dossier, and I quite honestly also do not think, let me be open and frank with you, that NATO as we speak can add value on the dossier of Gaza. You heard me say very clearly, and I've repeated this, I said this publicly before, under the umbrella of a comprehensive peace agreement in the region, I would not be the one to exclude a NATO role under the conditions I have given you. But I make a distinction between what is on NATO's plate as an alliance and what is on the plate of allies. And we have a big number of important allies, including P5 members of the Security Council in our midst. So, yes, sir, I agree with your analysis. I do too consider Iran as one of the major threats facing the world, and I underline with you, existential for Israel, given the positions taken there. I think with you that more should be done, and that we have not been successful enough to find the beginning of countering that threat. But I say that is as such not on NATO's plate, and I would not like it to see it on NATO's plate for the simple reason that NATO has enough on the plate already as I speak. And that is again a bit of the fil rouge, to use another French word, between the three subjects, or two you have addressed and I have addressed in my speech.
Professor Tobias.
I think that one could say that all the time that this country is still in war with some of its neighbors, the problems of identity of this country cannot come to the open, and they will be put on the national agenda once we will have peace. And more concretely, there is an ongoing debate in this country whether this country is a Mediterranean country, a Middle Eastern country, is a European country, is part of the Western world, and certainly the Israeli public will have to give its opinion about these matters. But it would be interesting to hear you, as an outsider, to give us your perception of Israel. Do you see Israel as part of the Western world, as was said here, or as something special, odd, or part of enlarged Europe? Or it would be interesting for us to see, because you are in a key position, and you know that every time that there is an initiative from the European Union about the Euromed, and then there is Union pour la Méditerranée from Sarkozy, and you have a Mediterranean dialogue, every time some of the people around ask ourselves, where should we positioned? The problem doesn't come to the open, I repeat, because we are still in an acute conflict and there is no peace. But there will eventually, I suppose, be peace in the future, and therefore a self-definition will have to come to the front, to the fore. How do you see this? If you can say something, or you are reluctant to say anything in order not to compromise yourself?
Well, listening to your last sentence, I would say, no, I'm not going to compromise myself.
That's not a good thing.
Because in that way I'm avoiding all the risks and the pitfalls which are, of course, behind your question. Let me give you one qualifier before seriously answering your question. And that qualifier is that it is, of course, really not up to me to enter into the fascinating world of Israeli politics. And I'm a keen follower, I can tell you, of Israeli politics, and I think it's fascinating. And it's from time to time a bit like of course, the Dutch. Two Israelis together, three opinions. Well, you know the fact. But let me give you nevertheless my personal assessment. But you must realize that I, of course, can never speak, if I answer your question, as a NATO Secretary General, because the NATO alliance simply doesn't have an opinion and should not have an opinion on this. I link my answer to what Oded Eran was saying in the beginning. It is my strong conviction that Israel, the state of Israel, is based on all the values I recognize in the Washington Treaty of NATO.
That was Uzi Arad.
But that was, excuse me, that was Uzi Arad. But you will agree on that.
Absolutely.
Okay. Otherwise, I'm in an even more awkward position. Uzi said this, and I can fully agree to that. Secondly, Israel, because of its coming about and its existence after the Holocaust and the horrors, will always be, in my opinion, a sui generis nation. And I come to Europe and NATO in a moment. Will always be a sui generis nation. And let me tell you a brief personal anecdote. 10 years ago, my wife and I celebrated our 25th marriage anniversary. And we asked our daughters to celebrate this anniversary, we're going to make a trip. Where do you want to go? Where do you want to go? They were 19 and 70 years of age then. And they said, without much hesitation, we want to go to Israel. And then I said, why Israel? Don't you want to go on safari or to the US or to New York? And they, we want to go to Israel. Why? My oldest daughter said, because I cannot imagine, she had finished the gymnasium in the Netherlands, I cannot imagine in the world any other state which is comparable to Israel. So I want to get to know that country. What did we do? We traveled more than 10 days from north to south, from east to west, visited everything, went to the museum, crisscrossed around the country. And they said this was one of the most valuable experiences you have ever given to us. So that is to underline my second element of my remark to your fundamental question, based on the same values, but on the other hand, always sui generis. And I think you should be proud as Israelis on the fact that this is a state which will always be sui generis. Point number 3, I do think that apart from telling you or saying you or giving you my opinion, Israel will at one day become a member of the European Union or will become a member of NATO. I know about this discussion in some think tank circles in Israel. I do not see that happen, being a member of, but I do see, and that is based on the values issue. I do see a closer relationship between the state of Israel and the European Union, and the state of Israel and NATO. What is, of course, in the way of that process from time to time, and I said it in my speech, is the fact that the peace process has only known a few ups and many downs in this region. And since all the 26 NATO allies and the 27 European Union member states are also democracies, they have their fierce debate on Israel, on the Middle East, on the peace process, and as we speak, on Gaza. And let me again be open and frank. I'm personally concerned because I hope that looking at the present situation, we are not going to lose, we, not only Israel, but you and me and us in quote unquote the West, and you're part of the West, we're not going to lose the moderate Arab voice, which I think you need and we need in this whole discussion. Perhaps I've said too much already. Based on the same values, sui generis, fascinating Israeli politics, who really must make their own decisions, and I think a closer relationship in the longer run with NATO and the European Union, without seeing membership on the horizon.
Thank you, Yap, for a very candid answer. We have Professor Rafi Israeli.
Mr. Secretary, it is an international convention that when nations operate internationally, they do that on the basis of some legitimacy. And that legitimacy is usually the United Nations, even though it's problematic in United Nations, which gives primacy to Gaza over Darfur, despite the enormous difference between the two. But when we come to NATO, it's even more problematic because the impression is that might, or the aggregate might of the NATO countries makes the right. because one can ask, who gave you the right to go to the Balkan to devastate countries, to ruin many cities? I remember during the NATO bombings of Serbia, the spokesman of NATO every night gave a report to the journalists, oh, today we had a very successful day. We bombed this, we bombed that, and so on and so forth. Or Afghanistan. Even though I might personally appreciate the positive role you may feel there, the question comes back to legitimacy. What is the base of your legitimacy? Do you relate to that at all? Or you operate just because you like it, or the aggregate of the countries of NATO would like to do so? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. I think let us put this region between brackets if you talk about legitimacy, because NATO has no intention to operate in any way in this region, as I hope I made crystal clear in my speech. That is not our intention. May I add that when you mention Afghanistan, NATO at the moment has 53,000 soldiers, men and women in uniform in Afghanistan. We do that under a very specific United Nations Security Council mandate. So about the legitimacy in Afghanistan, I think there can be no discussion at all. There can be no discussion at all. And I can tell you it's a complex operation in Afghanistan. And I think that when you discuss and when we discuss, for instance, an issue of civilian casualties, and it was said, I do know what it means. But I think you cannot question NATO's legitimacy in Afghanistan. There was a discussion, I agree with you, there was a discussion on NATO acting in 1999 against Serbia. There was a discussion between lawyers, there was a discussion between politicians. As there was a discussion between lawyers and between politicians on the legitimacy of the war in Iraq. There were people who said there is legitimacy, there were people who say there is not legitimacy. Judges don't decide, or lawyers. Politicians are hired to make choices. And I was a politician, I had to make choices, and from time to time I can tell you awkward choices when I was still active in Dutch politics. So you can discuss the legitimacy. I think, also in retrospect, that what happened in the Balkans in 1999 was legitimate. And please do realize what the situation was. And that NATO decided to act to prevent something which came very close to genocide. The Milosevic policy in Kosovo against the Kosovo Albanian majority. So I take your point, Professor, that you can discuss legitimacy. I can stay away from this region because NATO has no intention whatsoever about legitimacy. I take the point that the Security Council is the supremo in legitimacy, in deciding what is legitimate and what is not. And that is the reason that I made my remark, going back to the present about the Security Council resolution and the position taken by both Hamas and Israel on that resolution. So I can meet you a long way, but not entirely, because I question and I disagree with you when you put into question NATO's legitimacy. All NATO operations as we speak but one, all NATO operations and missions in 2009 are either directly or indirectly under a mandate of the United Nations Security Council. Afghanistan, Kosovo, the NATO training mission in Iraq. We do it in Darfur, helping the African Union without a specific Security Council resolution, I must admit, but with the informal blessing, as we do in Somalia. So we are covered. But being covered does not mean that in all cases, like in the Balkans and Kosovo, everybody will by definition agree on what is legitimate and what is not. The awkward choice by politicians, and I was one, is that at a certain stage you have to decide, as NATO had to decide in Kosovo, are we going to do it or are we not going to do it?
Take another one. One more. Last question. Naomi, you wanted to ask?
You mentioned your very clear conviction
Hold on
Mike's
a
coming.
second.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I'm just going to ask about Gaza. You mentioned very clearly that only the three conditions about a comprehensive peace agreement, consent of both parties, although we're not sure who the parties are on the Palestinian side, and the United Nations Security Council resolution. But down the line from here, down the line, I'm talking a few years down the line, if there is no fully comprehensive agreement, but there is quite a serious ceasefire agreement or an interim agreement, and there is consent of the parties, of both of the Palestinian Authority and the party in control in Gaza, and of course Israel, and there's a United Nations Security Council resolution. Would you not consider some sort of role, at least on the borders, on the Gaza borders or the West Bank borders?
I see what you mean. Let me distinguish, which I tried to do in my speech, and given the sensitivity of the subject, I gave some good thought on what I said in the speech, because I want to make clear that under these present circumstances and the events in Gaza as they have unfolded over the weeks, I repeat not, see any role for NATO. I do not. What I do see, and that was indeed what I think you more or less quoted correctly, what I do see is, and I said that before, there's no new what I said to you this evening here in Tel Aviv, what I do see is that, and let's hope it will come sooner than you and I might hope or might expect, there is a comprehensive agreement. Parties, and that is Israel, that is the Palestinians, that are important neighbors like Egypt and Jordan. And that is in between. I'm saying that is also, of course, the added value of the Mediterranean dialogue. We talk to each other. In the framework of the Mediterranean dialogue, I talk to the King of Jordan. I talk to your Prime Minister, your Foreign Minister, your Defense Minister. We talk to each other. We have a political dialogue. Although I underline, this is not the beginning of a NATO role. But, I repeat, in the scenario where there might or there would be something of a comprehensive peace agreement, I could very well imagine that Palestinians would at a certain stage also think in that direction. It's much too early to draw conclusions, and I'm afraid that present circumstances do not make me an optimist in this regard, because the region is again in turmoil. But let's use the Mediterranean dialogue to keep the political dialogue afloat. But let me also say that you'll appreciate that I'm a Secretary General of a 26-nation alliance. I say again, 26 democracies. And their views on the Middle East, as you know, do not necessarily coincide. I mean, I from time to time, even when it's not about the Middle East, I can tell you that it's not always easy to see that, to use a Dutch proverb, all noses are pointing in the same direction. That's my job, to see that all noses are pointing in the same direction. That is relevant for many other subjects than the Middle East. But NATO is not, as we speak, seeking a direct role. I think that should be crystal clear.
Mr. Secretary General, on behalf of all of us in this room, on behalf of the Atlantic Forum of Israel and on behalf of the Institute for National Strategic Studies, I do thank you very much for a very candid, open, and frank discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Pleasure. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Many thanks. Thank you. Good to see you again. Odette. Many thanks. I'm going.
After.
No, I